This one's called, Is That Really God Speaking to You?
If you are currently experiencing confusion on whether the Lord is speaking to you, this video is for you.
Well, currently I'm not, but it's always good to have information in your back pocket. You never know what life's gonna throw at you.
Too many times Christians fall into deception because they believe that the Lord is speaking to them when in reality they are speaking to themselves, or even worse, the enemy is speaking to them.
Really? Wow. I feel like the Lord should maybe think about fixing that. If his voice is so weak, you can't even tell the difference between that and talking to yourself, or Satan talking to you. That's a major problem. Talk louder or more impressively or something.
In this video, I'm going to give you 5 points that will teach you how to discern the Lord's voice and will help you in your present situation right now, future situations, and even help others.
All right, well, I appreciate the help, and in the spirit of helpfulness, I'm going to help you in return, because you've been talking for all of 20 seconds so far, and you've already had to push your glasses up 5 times. You seem to have some serious slippage issues on your nose pads. So this isn't sponsored, you don't have to go for this brand, but this is double-sided mounting tape. Slap some of this stuff on there, those things aren't going to move all day.
Isaiah 48, the grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever.
Okay, that doesn't sound like it's going to have much relevance to the technique, but nice verse, I guess.
We all have this friend.
No, I don't like those. I stay away from those.
Where we know what they would do and what they wouldn't do. We know that they would go out, say this, eat this, do that, and we know that they wouldn't do this, this, or this.
I wish I could see your hands so I knew what you were pointing at. I feel like I'm missing a lot about your presentation here. That pointing seems very, well, pointed.
So I want you to ask yourself, are you in that point of your relationship with Christ where you are able to understand what he would say, what he wouldn't say, what he calls us to do, and what he doesn't call us to do?
Well, I guess you could argue about whether I am or not. So are we starting off with the suggestion that to figure out if God is literally talking to you right now personally, you have to just ask yourself WWJD? And if J wouldn't D that, then it might just be you talking to yourself? Well, if you can just talk to yourself and suggest things to yourself, you could suggest things to yourself that Jesus would also say or do. Just because it lines up with something Jesus might have said doesn't mean Jesus is the one saying it right now.
We know the Lord says to love your enemies and to forgive others. So if you have a conviction not to forgive somebody and not to love someone else, we obviously know the answer to that.
Sure, I'm a Christian. I'm not supposed to do that. That's against the rules. Okay, sure, so in that case you could say that's not God speaking to you. I suppose that helps to rule it out, but the more interesting question is how do you confirm that he is? Now, you do have 5 points, so I guess it's fair that you would start off with one that says, look, if it's obviously not from God, then that's not from God. That's fairly reasonable. I can accept that.
So I want you to ask yourself, do you know God's character?
Yes.
How do we know God's character?
I don't know. I lied. Sorry.
We know God's character by reading his word and seeing how our situations and scenarios match up with what God would approve of and what he wouldn't approve of.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, I never would have thought of that. So I have a thought, and I can find some verse in the Bible that kind of seems to line up with it, which is usually how people do it. So my thought isn't necessarily like a bad, un-Christian kind of thought. Now what?
On if God's voice aligns with the word he has given us.
You mean on if the voice you're hearing in your head aligns with it? Because we're not assuming from the start that this is God's voice. I don't get this, though. If God spends his time actually talking to people, personally, why does he speak in such a way that it's apparently indistinguishable from just a thought you had? And you have to go check it against the Bible to see if it sounds anything like God. And then, frankly, still have no idea, because if you're a Christian, you're probably going to be thinking a lot of things that line up with the Bible. That's a big part of being a Christian. I keep jumping ahead, though. I'm sorry, we're still only on point number 1. I get it, you're laying the groundwork of just eliminate other possibilities first. Please continue.
The Lord is not a spirit of confusion.
Okay, then why does he confuse you by speaking in a way that you can't even tell if it's him? That's incredibly confusing, and he doesn't have to do that. He chooses to do that. I mean, he speaks into your head, and your first thing is like, oh my god, is this God? I don't know. What do I do? I better go looking for YouTube videos to tell me how to interpret the thoughts in my head and see if they're from God. Oh, I watched this YouTube video guide about how to tell, and the first thing it says is go study the whole scripture to see if the voice is inconsistent with it, and maybe at some point I'll figure out if it's not God, but if that doesn't happen, I still don't know if it is God. This is not the most reliable approach, and think about how much worse it would have been before you had YouTube videos videos like this to go to, from young gentlemen who somehow have answers to these questions that confuse other people, or before there was access to copies of the Bible in your own language. This would be hideously confusing.
1 Corinthians 14:33. For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. I want you to ask yourself, are you experiencing a confusion that is pulling you away from the Lord, inciting fear, doubt, anxiety?
The pace of this video is giving me anxiety. You're talking very fast. Let's calm down a little bit. Be peaceful. Now, based on what you've just said, I don't really understand what you mean by confusion anymore. I mean, to me, confusion is like, what's going on? What is happening? I don't understand this. Which is exactly what's been happening in this person's head that you've been describing since the moment that apparently God talked into their head. But apparently when you say confusion, you mean something else.
I'll speak from my own personal example. In my own life, I was a store manager for a company, and I had this fear and anxiety on whether I'd be successful in life, so I stayed. But I knew deep down that it wasn't from the Lord, and I was following my own plan.
Okay. So you were managing the store, and you were doing it not because that was really what you wanted to do, but because you were afraid that if you stopped managing the store and tried to do something else that you would have preferred to do, that you would fail in that endeavor, and so you were sticking with the safe option. And because of that, I think, you knew deep down that this wasn't from the Lord, that you were following your own plan, although this doesn't actually seem like it was your plan. It seems like you wanted to do something else, you were just afraid to. Again, I'm not really seeing how we can distinguish here between what comes from you and what comes from God, because this sounds like you just talking about your own feelings. Now, the fact is this. In life, no matter what you're doing, you're going to have times where you feel unsatisfied. You think, maybe I should make a change, and you're going to have to make a decision by weighing different priorities. And one of those priorities, of course, is going to be, if I make a change, will that change be successful? Will it get me what I hope to get out of it? Will I move ahead in my life? Or will I fail and be set back and have to reevaluate and come up with something else? There's always going to be some amount of anxiety in making decisions that affect your life because you don't know the future. Now, sometimes those anxieties are going to be enough that you decide not to make the change. And you're right, if you choose not to make a change on the basis of your anxiety, which on some level is based on your evaluation of the likelihood of you succeeding, that is you following your own preference, but it would also be you following your own preference if you decided to quit and do something else. You already want to do that. You don't want to be the store manager. It's not like if you quit and followed your dream of being a starving artist, you'd be doing that against your will. It's not like when I quit my nice, well-paying job that I was unsatisfied with in an incredibly risky attempt to rely on my very little AdSense money a month before the adpocalypse. That was me being forced out of my job by the word of God. I wanted out. I wanted to take the risk and try to build something more fulfilling. And believe me, dude, considering you're probably like 20, I can guarantee you that I had more fear and anxiety doing that than you had quitting your job as a store manager. Honestly, it's starting to sound like what you're going to suggest is that anytime someone doesn't take a risk because of financial considerations or career considerations or whatever, that's them following themselves or Satan, and taking the risk that the fear and anxiety are preventing you from taking is always the godly option. Because when you think about following your calling and maybe succeeding, that thought feels nice. And then as a Christian, you go, well, that must be from God then, because that feels nicer than being a store manager, which is kind of boring. I get a strong feeling that that's what you're driving at, but if so, it's not very good advice. These decisions should be made on a case-by-case basis.
In the midst of this, I was losing my relationship with Christ. I was sinning continuously. I was doubting. I had anxiety, and I had fear for my own future.
All of that just for managing a store, huh? Why? Like, I get that it can be boring and frustrating. I know that feeling. Hell, I have the same problem with this job often enough. That's just how things are. But that's not enough to prompt the response you're talking about. I'm a bit doubtful that the job itself was the only thing at play here.
But grace be to God for giving me the conviction to quit and pulling me out.
You know, atheists quit jobs when they're unhappy and miserable with them too. I mean, if your response to this job was really so bad, it kind of sounds like everything in your life and in your mind was pushing you out, other than just, how am I going to make as much money? And even with that, you said the job was inciting these thoughts of doubt and fear and anxiety about your own future. So the thought of leaving, sure, caused some fear and anxiety, but so did staying. What is it about any of this that you take as God telling you to do something? It really sounds like you just had to make a career decision and you made the one that made you happier. And clearly you are happier having made it. You talk about it positively. It sounds very much like you made the choice that was more in line with your preferences. It appears God didn't tell you to do something that God wanted wanted, but you did not. You're not like, well, I'm much more miserable now. I'm living under a bridge. I'm hungry 5 days a week, and I don't understand why he wanted this, and I wish he didn't, but I did the right thing anyway, because that was the voice of God. It lined up with the scripture, and somehow I just knew it was him. But no, instead, conveniently, God told you to do the thing you already wanted to do. So again, how do we distinguish the voice of God from just your own feelings?
So I want you to ask yourself, are you feeling a conviction of peace, calmness, and clarity that aligns with God's character like the last point? Or are you experiencing a confusion of doubt, anxiety? Is it pulling you away from the Lord? Are you experiencing fear?
You didn't say you felt peaceful and calm about leaving your job. You said you felt fearful and anxious about leaving your job, and therefore you stayed. But somehow you knew that staying wasn't what God wanted you to do, so ultimately you did the thing that made you feel fearful and anxious and left your job. And from the way you tell that story, it sounds like you were pretty confused until you made the decision. You had an inner conflict about what to do. I'm not detecting this peace, calmness, or clarity that you talk about. Your story doesn't seem to line up with this idea that the voice of God and what God tells you to do should bring you peace, calmness, and clarity. Sure, after you left your job, maybe you did feel more peace, calmness, and clarity, but you're not talking about what happens after you act on the voice. You're talking about what happens when you're trying to figure out what the voice even is. You see what I'm saying? The story doesn't seem to line up that well with the advice you're giving.
God's voice is like a spiritual anchor. Even in the midst of chaos, his direction grounds us. Confusion is like waves. It is uncertain. It continuously moves. We don't know what it's going to do.
Look, I'm sure that your dislike of being a store manager was fairly steady after a certain point once you got tired of it. Is that all you're talking about? Like whatever you consistently don't like is the non-God option? This video is causing me a lot of confusion and lack of clarity. I notice that religious advice very often is like this. Confusing and vague and not at all straightforward. Almost every time I listen to stuff like this, that's the impression I get. Why is that?
But God's voice is an anchor, and it keeps us still, and it keeps us firm, and it gives us peace knowing we can hold on.
Okay. Still and firm in what sense? When you want to change everything, you're still and firm in the conviction of wanting to do that? So like consistency of desire? And if that's the case, is that something that can't come from you? Or from the enemy, for that matter? Is it not possible, for example, that the enemy was making you feel bad about your job and was pushing you to want to leave, and God was the one putting the fear and anxiety about leaving into you? That maybe if you had just accepted your role and come to peace with it, that fear and anxiety would have subsided. Well, apparently not, because you said you knew God wanted you to leave. But then again, we come back to how, which is what the video is about, which you haven't actually really touched on in any meaningful way yet. Also, you said you were going to have 5 points here, and I'm not sure how we're dividing those up. You're halfway through the video, and we seem to still be on the first one.
So is what you're hearing bringing you peace, clarity, calmness, and aligning with the Lord's voice? Or is it bringing you confusion, doubt, anxiety, fear, and bringing you away from the Lord?
I really feel like if you just said all this without telling your story, that would have made this much less confusing. Because what you're saying kind of is clear, but your story seems to kind of show the opposite. I guess that's why I'm having trouble understanding you. But okay, as a basic principle, if you have a thought, you go, should I do this? And it makes you feel good, makes you feel like, yeah, that'd be nice. I feel good about that. Then that's what you should do because that's from the Lord. Well, okay, but if it's not from the Lord, that's probably also what you should do. That appears to be the thing you're comfortable with and that you actually want to do. Whether you think you've heard God's voice or not, I mean, I'm an atheist, I don't hear God's voice, I just have ideas. If you have one idea that gives you a feeling of peace and clarity and calmness, and another that fills you with confusion and doubt and anxiety and fear, with no positive aspect whatsoever, apparently, why would you follow that second option? I don't care who it's from, it doesn't sound like a good option. The choice seems incredibly obvious. But this video isn't about how to tell which choice is obviously better, or how to just generally make choices that make you happier. The video is about how to tell if an idea that you had is literally the voice of God actually speaking inside your head. This doesn't seem to get you there.
Jonah 1:2. Arise, go to Nineveh, and call out against it. Jonah didn't want to go, but God called him for a purpose. Too many times, people confuse confusion with discomfort. Are you experiencing confusion or are you experiencing discomfort?
So discomfort being something like, that sounds hard, this is gonna suck, that kind of thing?
The Lord doesn't care about your comfort. He cares about your character. He cares how this is going to develop you and get you closer to where he wants you to be. God's voice is often uncomfortable, but it's always purposeful.
But if the voice tells you to do something hard, that of course doesn't mean it's from God. That could still be from the enemy or from yourself. So we're still really not making that much progress in figuring out if this voice is from God. The only thing we have so far is, okay, you might not like the idea of the process of getting to the point that the voice is telling you to get to. It might make you feel fearful, anxious, and so on, or uncomfortable. But the thought of being at the point you're thinking about getting to makes you feel nice. So it's an idea that might take some work or take some risk, and you don't feel like doing that, but you like the idea. Am I understanding you correctly?
God will often call you to things that are uncomfortable, inconvenient. But in our own minds, in our own voice, we always look for what's the easiest route. And sometimes the easiest route seems to be the hardest.
Okay, so you as a human are going to be inclined to try to figure out what the easiest route is and go with that, or at least that's sort of what you're going to be inclined to go with. But this other route that sounds hard and uncomfortable and inconvenient might actually be easier in the long run. I mean, you're definitely right in a sense. That's kind of how I felt about my YouTube thing, where my thinking was there's going to be a lot to do. It's going to be kind of rough at the start, but if it works, it's going to pay off way better, and life is going to improve as a result. Even though at first it's uncomfortable and inconvenient and scary, long term that is the choice that will make life easier, and that was the case. My voice that was telling me to do that was correct. I suppose you could disagree and tell me it was God's voice that told me to do that. Do you think God wanted me doing this job? The fact is, nothing you've said so far has anything directly to do with God at all. You could switch God out of this video completely and replace it with any other self-help concept, and the overall point could be exactly the same. What you're giving is really just vague general self-help advice.
And the easiest route is following what the Lord has called us to do. And this all ties back into knowing whether we are experiencing confusion or an inner peace and seeing if it aligns with the Lord's voice.
Right, I still can't find any way to interpret that other than, does the idea of achieving the goal that you're thinking about make you feel good? Do you feel better leaving the store manager position and doing whatever you do now? Or do you like the idea of staying a store manager until you're 65? This is what humans do. They pursue goals, they overcome challenges, sometimes they set challenges for themselves. If they're doing something where they're just sort of languishing without any challenge at all, some of them tend to get a little bit unsatisfied and they go seeking out new challenges. I mean, your advice is basically just don't sit on your heels and get complacent and follow your dreams, man. And if you do that, that means God must have been speaking to you, really? Is that all there is to this?
Galatians 5:22-23. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So I want you to ask yourself, is what you're hearing bearing the fruits of the Spirit? Is it bearing actions of not self-seeking, but humility of serving others? Is it bringing love, peace, joy, kindness, and especially self-control?
So is it making you grumpy and pissed off every day? You come home in a bad mood? You know, I definitely had that problem when I was at the office job. I would come home in a pretty bad mood, and I'd be in a pretty bad mood pretty often. But once I left the office job and started doing YouTube, it actually got worse for a while. In those first 2 or 3 years, things were kind of shaky. But eventually, once we managed to get things settled out and working better, and especially once we left the city, things really calmed down, and so did I. I am a much more chill person than I used to be, and I much more commonly show those positive feelings and ways of acting that you're talking about. So it turns out it was the right choice in the long run, but that took years to show itself. Again, you're just giving this general advice, which if you were giving it in non-theistic language, would be equally useful and equally applicable in many circumstances, and really fundamentally doesn't have anything to do with God or religion at all. Why is it so hard to discern if an omnipotent being is speaking directly into your brain that you have to resort to platitudes about just do whatever makes you feel peaceful and loving and kind, man? You don't need God for that. I could have told you that if I was in a weird mood.
Not just towards yourself, but others as well. Is this career and relationship going to bear the fruits of the Spirit? Is this career, relationship, and circumstance that you're in bringing peace, aligning with God's character, and bearing the fruits of the Spirit, which holds kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control.
Does this career and relationship that you're in make you want to come home and hug your wife and go out on a dinner date? Or does it make you want to come home and yell at your wife and smack her? Now look, you might have some opinions about which kind of feelings you want the events in your life to provoke within you. Everything inside of you might be screaming at you that this really sucks and you hate it, and you want to change it because it's having a very negative effect on your mental state. That may or may not be God talking to you. How can you tell? Well, I don't know. God's not going to tell you to make it worse, at least. So if instead you have the feeling that you should make it worse, that's probably like Satan or your own dumb self. Other than that, I don't know. Like, for real, man, you haven't given me a single positive way to determine if this is God talking in the entire video yet. You've said God will give you ideas that make you feel good, and seem like they'll have good results that make you feel peaceful and loving or whatever, but you haven't said that you can't just have those ideas. You haven't said that you can't have the idea of leaving your store manager job if it's making you unhappy. So we still don't know how to distinguish whether it's God's voice or your voice. You've given me some advice on how to tell if it's not God's voice, but you've given me no way to distinguish God's voice from my own mind having an idea. Am I just supposed to assume that any idea that makes me feel good or seems to have good results was God talking to me the whole time because it was a good idea? That doesn't seem like a very reliable approach, but if not that, then what?
If this voice you are hearing is leading you towards actions that create division, frustration, or pride, that is not from God.
Yes, I've got plenty of advice from you on how to tell if it's not God, but that's not the point of the video.
My last point is...
Last point? Out of 5? That means we've gone through 4 different points, and I have no idea how to tell which point was which. It all kind of just seemed like one thing that was all merged together.
Proverbs 11:14. Where there is no guidance, a people falls, but in abundance of counselors there is safety. And I'll speak from a personal example. When I was first coming to Christ, I remember I was very against fellowship. I have always had a mindset of, I can do it myself. I'm independent. I can learn. I can Google it. But the reality is that fellowship brings wise counsel. You need to have wise counsel.
Yeah, like literally God speaking into your brain personally. What wiser counsel do you need? You're talking about fellowship. It sounds like you're talking about asking other people for advice. What do other people have to do with this? The omnipotent, omniscient creator of the universe is directly instructing you. What does any random, sinful, fallen, dipshit human have to do with it? How is God's direct voice so weak that the opinions of your friends who didn't hear it are a more efficient way to decide if it exists at all than hearing it in the first place?
You need to have friends that are going to sharpen you in Christ, in the spiritual realm. Not friends who are going to pull you away from Christ. You need to have a church that holds the fruit of the Spirit so they can give you wise counsel.
Okay, so you have to surround yourself with people who will make you stick with your religion and keep on believing the nonsense. Yeah, I know that's part of the religion maintaining itself. Obviously, that's going to be advised by the religion. But what does that have to do with deciding if God is speaking to you?
If you are trying to hear the Lord's voice, I want you to share what you're hearing with a trusted spiritual leader, friend, or anyone that follows Christ genuinely and deeply, because they can confirm and help you and provide a perspective that you may not be able to hold.
So if God himself is speaking to you, counseling you, that's not good enough? Because you can't tell if it's him. No, you have to go to your church or your Christian friends and be like, hey, I don't really like being a store manager. I think God might be telling me to quit. And then you're supposed to, leave it up to them to tell you, yeah, that is God, or no, that's not God. Because somehow they're going to know better than you do? They didn't hear the voice in your head. How are they going to know better than God himself if the voice of God in your head is God? You know, from the sounds of it, it doesn't sound like anything's actually happening. It sounds like you're just having feelings. It's like you're speaking in code, where you say one thing. You say, God spoke in my head, and then I went and asked my friends if it's really God's voice. But you mean something very different. Something like, I had an idea, and I went and asked my friend if it sounds like a good idea. So the term God's voice is really just code for your brain having ideas that seem to have desirable results. And because you're not always confident that that's going to be the case, you ask other people who you trust to see if they think that might be the case. You're just doing normal human stuff, making normal human decisions with normal human feelings about it, having normal human conversations in normal human social reality, but you're replacing all the words you talk about it with fantastical religious terms, for indiscernible reasons.
The Lord works through people. He uses people as vessels. So the confirmation that you may be seeking may be in the wise counsel of someone else.
Or to put it into English, sometimes your friends have a valuable perspective. Sometimes they'll think about things in a way that you might not have. And so they might help you to see that something that seems like a good idea really isn't as good as it seems. Or an idea that kind of scares you might be the best thing you could do anyway. If an actually real, all-powerful supernatural force wants to tell you something, you're not going to have to ask your friends if it did.
And don't think about wise counsel as something bad.
Why would I think about it as something bad? Yes, it pays to talk to other people about big decisions and see if maybe they have some different ideas about it. Depends on who you ask, of course. Maybe there's some people you shouldn't bother talking to about it, but in general, it's not the worst idea. You don't have some all-knowing entity that you can ask for advice who's actually going to give you any. So you're going to have to rely on your friends and family and community.
Think about it as like a second opinion. When you go to a doctor and they tell you something, you usually get a second opinion. When you buy an outfit, you usually get a second opinion.
What? Why would I do that? I don't think I've ever talked to anyone about my clothes in my entire life.
So what's the problem with asking a second opinion on whether you're hearing the Lord's voice or not? Peace.
That was a very abrupt ending. Anyway, why is it that every time I watch one of these videos about how to tell if God's really speaking to you, I come away from it with a bunch of advice that makes it sound like God doesn't speak to anyone at all? It always seems like God is just a placeholder term for human feelings and ideas. I don't understand the purpose of framing normal human mental and social events in these terms. Anyway, thank you for watching, and if you would, before you go, please do give the video a like and click subscribe if you haven't, and if you like the channel, maybe consider supporting. A few bucks a month helps a huge amount, and enormous thanks to all of my supporters who've already made that choice. Early access, email list, list.logicked.com, and I'll see you next time.